What's good, everybody? I'm Gigi. You're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. It is the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up with no chasers. Today, I'm reading an article written by Kimberle Williams Crenshaw entitled Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, Transformation and Legitimation in Antidiscrimination Law. The article was published in the Harvard Law Review, Volume 101, May 1988, Number 7. Kimberle Crenshaw begins her exploration by discussing the Living the Dream Directive, which was part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission's guidelines. This directive serves as a backdrop for her broader discussion on the civil rights movement's trajectory and its critiques. It aims to balance the celebration of progress and racial equality with the acknowledgment of ongoing disparities between blacks and whites. Moving from this foundation, Crenshaw delves into the new rights critique, represented by figures like Thomas Sowell and members of the Reagan Administration. They argue that the civil rights movement has already achieved its goal of formal equality, making further struggle under the banner of civil rights unnecessary. Contrasting this is the New Left's perspective, particularly scholars from the Conference on Critical Legal Studies, CLS. They challenge the civil rights movement, but from a different angle, arguing that the legal rights discourse itself is counterproductive and legitimizes the very racial inequality it aims to combat. Crenshaw doesn't let either side off the hook. She counters both critiques, arguing that the new rights view is overly simplistic and politically motivated. She also suggests that the new left's focus on legal consciousness fails to consider the role of racism in societal hegemony. She then shifts her focus to the role of anti-discrimination law, positing that it is not a fixed commitment, but an ongoing ideological struggle. This law can be harnessed for both conservative and liberal views, making it ambiguous and subject to change. Expanding on this, Crenshaw includes the role of racism as a central ideological pillar in her discussion. She argues that any critique or reform must take into account race consciousness, emphasizing its importance in understanding societal structures. Crenshaw concludes her exploration by stating that legal reform was a viable strategy for the black community, given the limited alternatives. She emphasizes the need for a distinct political consciousness within the black community to counteract the co-opting forces of legal reform. The following is the abstract to the article. Recent works by neoconservatives and by critical legal scholars have suggested that civil rights reforms have been an unsuccessful means of achieving racial equality in America. In this article, Professor Crenshaw considers these critiques and analyzes the continuing role of racism in the subordination of black Americans. The neoconservative emphasis on formal colorblindness, she argues, fails to recognize the indeterminacy of civil rights laws and the force of lingering racial disparities. The critical scholars who emphasize the legitimating role of legal ideology and legal rights rhetoric are substantially correct, according to Professor Crenshaw. But they fail to appreciate the choices and possibilities available to an oppressed group such as blacks. The critics, she suggests, ignore the singular power of racism as a hegemonic force in American society. Blacks have been created as a subordinated other, and formal reform has merely repackaged racism. Anti-discrimination law, she argues, has largely succeeded in eliminating the symbolic manifestations of racial oppression, but has allowed the perpetuation of material subordination of blacks. Professor Crenshaw concludes by demonstrating the importance of exposing the racist nature of ostensibly neutral norms and of devising strategies for change that include the pragmatic use of legal rights. Introduction. In 1984, President Reagan signed a bill that created the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission. The commission was charged with the responsibility of issuing guidelines for states and localities to follow in preparing their observances of Martin Luther King's birthday. The commission task would not be easy. Although King's birthday had come to symbolize the massive social movement that grew out of efforts of African Americans to end the long history of racial oppression in America, the first official observance of the holiday would take place in the face of at least two disturbing obstacles. First, a constant, if not increasing, socioeconomic disparity between the races, and second, a hostile administration devoted to changing the path of civil rights reforms that some believe responsible for most of the movement's progress. A focus on the continuing disparities between blacks and whites might call, not for celebration, but for strident criticism of America's failure to make good on its promise of racial equality. Yet, such criticisms would overlook the progress that has been made, progress which the holiday itself represents. The commission apparently resolved this dilemma by calling for a celebration of progress toward racial equality while urging continued commitment to this ideal. This effort to reconcile the celebration of an ideal with conditions that bespeak its continuing denial was given the ironic but altogether appropriate title, Living the Dream. The Living the Dream directive aptly illustrates Professor Derek Bell's observation that most Americans, black and white, viewed the civil rights crusade as a long, slow, but always upward pull that must, given the basic precepts of the country and the commitment of its people to equality and liberty, eventually end in the full enjoyment by blacks of all rights and privileges of citizenship enjoyed by whites. Commentators on both the right and the left, however, have begun to cast doubt upon the continuing vitality of this shop-worn theme. The position of the new right, articulated by members of the Reagan Administration and by neoconservative scholars such as Thomas Sowell, is that the goal of the civil rights movement, the extension of formal equality to all Americans regardless of color, has already been achieved. Therefore, the vision of a continuing struggle under the banner of civil rights is inappropriate. The position of the New Left, presented in the work of scholars associated with the Conference on Critical Legal Studies, CLS for short, also challenges the perception that the civil rights struggle represents a long, steady march toward social transformation. CLS scholars do not significantly disagree with the goal of racial equality, but assert only the basic counterproductivity of seeking that objective through the use of legal rights. Indeed, CLS scholars claim that even engaging in rights discourse is incompatible with a broader strategy of social change. They view the extension of rights, although perhaps energizing political struggle or producing apparent victories in the short run, as ultimately legitimating the very racial inequality and oppression that such extension purports to remedy. This article challenges both the New Left and New Right critiques of the civil rights movement. Part 2 develops the critical indictment of the neoconservative critique. The right argues that the civil rights community reduces civil rights to mere special interest politics. Because the right views law and politics as essentially distinct, it presumes that demonstrating that the civil rights vision is essentially political renders it illegitimate. Yet, as is argued below, the neoconservative interpretation of anti-discrimination law reveals assumptions about racism and society that can no more transcend politics than can the civil rights vision. Thus, the neoconservative critique collapses under its own criticism. The civil rights community, however, must come to terms with the fact that anti-discrimination discourse is fundamentally ambiguous and can accommodate conservative as well as liberal views of race and equality. This dilemma suggests that the civil rights constituency cannot afford to view anti-discrimination doctrine as a permanent pronouncement of society's commitment to ending racial subordination. Rather, anti-discrimination law represents an ongoing ideological struggle in which the occasional winners harness the moral, coercive, consensual power of law. Nonetheless, the victories it offers can be ephemeral and the risk of engagement substantial. Part 3 criticizes the CLS attack on civil rights. Critical scholarship clarifies the crisis of anti-discrimination law, identifying potential cost of engaging in liberal reform discourse. The key flaw in CLS writing on legal ideology and hegemony, however, is that it overlooks the relationship of racism to hegemony. Critical literature focuses primarily on legal consciousness and on consensual domination, leaving coercion and popular consciousness unexamined. Because racism is intimately connected to both coercion and popular consciousness, the critics' failure to examine them undermines the utility of their critique in analyzing the oppression of Black people and in explaining domination and legitimation in society as a whole. Part 4 expands the CLS perspective to address the role of racism, presenting a somewhat altered vision of society, legitimacy, and racial reform. This expanded critique presents race consciousness as a central ideological and political pillar upholding existing social conditions. Race consciousness, I contend, must be taken into account in efforts to understand hegemony and the politics of racial reform. The civil rights movement is recast as a radical challenge to the dominant order, even though co-optation has been and remains an ever-present threat to the movement. Finally, a realistic examination of the limited alternatives available to Blacks makes it clear that legal reform was a viable pragmatic strategy for Blacks confronted with the threat of unbridled racism on one hand and co-optation on the other. In the course of my analysis, I wish to stress 3 crucial aspects of the consideration of race in the American legal context. First, racism is a central ideological underpinning of American society. Critical scholars who focus on legal consciousness alone thus fail to address one of the most crucial ideological components of the dominant order. The CLS practice of delegitimating false and constraining ideas must include race consciousness if the accepted objective is to transcend oppressive belief systems. Second, the definitional tension in anti-discrimination law, which attempts to distinguish equality as a process from equality as result, is more productively characterized as a conflict between the stated goals of anti-discrimination law. Is the goal limited to the mere rejection of white supremacy as a normative vision? Or may the goal be expanded to include a societal commitment to the eradication of the substantive conditions of Black subordination? Finally, the Black community must develop and maintain a distinct political consciousness in order to prevail against the co-opting force of legal reform. History has shown that the most valuable political asset of the Black community has been its ability to assert a collective identity and to name its collective political reality. Liberal reform discourse must not be allowed to undermine the Black collective identity. Today, we're diving into the second section of Kimberle Crenshaw's seminal article, Race, Reform, and Retrenchment, Transformation and Legitimation in Anti-Discrimination Law. This section unpacks the Reagan Administration's approach to civil rights, which was a significant departure from previous policies. Influenced by neoconservative think tanks, the administration advocated for a colorblind, formalistic approach aiming to repeal affirmative action and other race-specific policies. While they saw themselves as restoring the true essence of civil rights, many questioned whether their actions were anti-Black and ideologically opposed to civil rights to begin with. The section also delves into the perspective of Thomas Sowell, a neoconservative scholar. Sowell argues that the civil rights movement has strayed from its roots, focusing more on equal outcomes rather than equal treatment under the law. He criticizes the judiciary for allowing their political views to influence legal interpretations, even warning that this could lead to fascism. However, Crenshaw critiques Sowell's arguments, pointing out that he fails to provide concrete definitions of what the real law is. She highlights the tension in anti-discrimination law between focusing on the process and focusing on the results. According to Crenshaw, Sowell's perspective is more of a personal interpretation rather than an objective truth. Crenshaw then explores the dilemma facing the civil rights movement. She argues that the adoption of equal opportunity rhetoric hasn't necessarily led to an end to racial inequality. She warns that the commitment to fighting discrimination is waning, both in the judiciary and among the general populace. This could make it difficult for African Americans to articulate their experiences and engage in collective action. In sum, the second section of Crenshaw's article argues that the debate over civil rights is not just a legal or philosophical one, it's a complex issue deeply rooted in differing interpretations of society, history, and justice. Crenshaw calls for a more nuanced, contextualized understanding of civil rights that takes into account the lived experiences of marginalized communities. Section 2. The New Right Attack, Civil Rights as Politics. Subsection A. The Neoconservative Offensive. The Reagan administration arrived in Washington in 1981 with an agenda that was profoundly hostile to the civil rights policies of the previous 2 decades. The principal basis of its hostility was a formalistic, colorblind view of civil rights that had developed in the neoconservative think tanks during the 1970s. Neoconservative doctrine singles out race-specific civil rights policies as one of the most significant threats to the democratic political system. Emphasizing the need for strictly colorblind policies, this view calls for the repeal of affirmative action and other race-specific remedial policies, urges an end to class-based remedies, and calls for the administration to limit remedies to what it calls actual victims of discrimination. A number of early episodes sent a clear message that the Reagan administration would be inhospitable to the civil rights policies adopted by earlier administrations. For example, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, under Deputy Attorney General William Bradford Reynolds, abruptly changed sides in several cases. Other serious attacks on the civil rights constituency included Reagan's attempt to fire members of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, the administration's opposition to the 1982 amendment of the Voting Rights Act, and Reagan's veto of the Civil Rights Restoration Act. These fervent attempts to change the direction of civil rights law generated speculation that the Reagan administration was anti-Black and ideologically opposed to civil rights. Yet, the administration denied that any racial animus motivated its campaign. Far from viewing themselves as opponents of civil rights, Reagan, Reynolds, and others in the administration apparently saw themselves as true civil rights advocates seeking to restore the original meaning of civil rights. Neoconservative scholar Thomas Sowell perhaps best articulates the philosophy underlying the New Right policies on race and law. Sowell presents the neoconservative struggle against prevailing civil rights policies as nothing less than an attempt to restore law to its rightful place and to prevent the descent of American society into fascism. Sowell suggests that the growing popularity of white hate groups is evidence of the instability wrought by improvident civil rights policies. To Sowell, the growth of anti-Black sentiment is an understandable reaction to a vision that has threatened to undermine democratic institutions, delegitimize the court system, and demoralize the American people. The culprit in this epic struggle is a political view which Sowell has dubbed the civil rights vision. According to Sowell, this view developed as the leaders of the civil rights movement shifted the movement's original focus on equal treatment under the law to a demand for equal results, notwithstanding genuine differences in ability, delegitimizing the movement's claim in a democratic society. The civil rights vision has nothing to do with the achievement of civil rights today, according to Sowell, because, in reality, the battle for civil rights was fought and won at great cost many years ago. Sowell's central criticism is that the visionaries have attempted to infuse the law with their own political interpretation, which Sowell characterizes as separate from and alien to the true meaning of civil rights. He argues that, although these visionaries have struggled and sacrificed in the name of civil rights, they nonetheless merit censure for undermining the stability of American society through their politicization of the law. Sowell singles out the judiciary for a special harsh criticism. Judges, according to Sowell, have ignored the original understanding of Title VII and imposed their own political views instead. The perversion of the law by federal judges have been especially brazen, Sowell charges. According to Sowell, judges have participated in a process by which law, plain honesty, and democracy itself have been sacrificed on the altar of missionary self-righteousness. Sowell cautions that when judges allow law to be overridden by politics, the threat of fascism looms ever large. When judges reduce the law to a question of who has the power and whose ox is gored, they can hardly disclaim responsibility or be morally superior when others respond in kind. We can only hope that the response will not someday undermine our whole concept of law and freedom. Fascism has historically arisen from the utter disillusionment of the people with democratic institutions. Subsection B, a critique of the critique, the indeterminacy of civil rights discourse. Given the seriousness of his accusations, particularly those against the judiciary, one would expect Sowell's proof of subversion to be substantial. His repeated accusations that the true law has been subverted raise expectations that he will eventually identify some determinate, clearly discernible version of that law. Sowell's true law would presumably stand apart from the politics of race, yet control it without being influenced by inappropriate political factors. Sowell's only proof that the law has been subverted, however, rests on his assumption that such subversion is self-evident. In the context of voting, for example, Sowell declares simply, the right to vote is a civil right. The right to win is not. Equal treatment does not mean equal results. Sowell fails to substantiate his accusations because he cannot tell us what the real law is, or whether it ever existed as he claims. He simply embraces language from anti-discrimination texts, imports his own meaning of its purpose, and ignores contradictory purposes and interpretations. Here, Sowell, apparently without realizing it, merely embraces one aspect of a tension that runs throughout anti-discrimination law, the tension between equality as a process and equality as a result. This basic conflict has given rise to two distinct rhetorical visions in the body of anti-discrimination law, one of which I have termed the expansive view, the other the restrictive view. The expansive view stresses equality as a result and looks to real consequences for African Americans. It interprets the objective of anti-discrimination law as the eradication of the substantive conditions of Black subordination and attempts to enlist the institutional power of the courts to further the national goal of eradicating the effects of racial oppression. The restrictive vision, which exists side by side with this expansive view, treats equality as a process, downplaying the significance of actual outcomes. The primary objective of anti-discrimination law, according to this vision, is to prevent future wrongdoing rather than redress present manifestations of past injustice. Wrongdoing, moreover, is seen primarily as isolated actions against individuals rather than as a societal policy against an entire group. Nor does the restrictive view contemplate the courts playing a role in redressing harms from America's racist past, as opposed to merely policing society to eliminate a narrow set of proscribed discriminatory practices. Moreover, when injustice is found, efforts to redress it must be balanced against and limited by competing interests of white workers, even when those interests are actually created by the subordination of blacks. The innocence of whites weighs more heavily than do the past wrongs committed upon blacks and the benefits that whites derived from those wrongs. In sum, the restrictive view seeks to proscribe only certain kinds of subordinating acts, and then only when other interests are not overly burdened. Although the tension between the expansive and restrictive vision is present throughout anti-discrimination law, Sowell dismisses the full complexity of the problem by simply declaring that equal process is completely unrelated to equal results. Yet, it is not nearly as clear as Sowell suggests that the right to vote, for instance, has nothing to do with winning. No measure of a process's effectiveness can be wholly separated from the purpose for which it was initiated. Sowell implicitly acknowledges that voting is related to some notion of actual representation. Having done so, he cannot completely sever that process from its admitted purpose. Depending on how one views society, democracy, and the historic significance of racial disenfranchisement, the appropriate relationship between voting and representation can be defined to require anything from at-large representation to full proportional representation. Sowell's attempt to sever voting from winning merely raises the question of process and results. It does not answer it. As the expansive and restrictive views of anti-discrimination law reveal, there simply is no self-evident interpretation of civil rights inherent in the terms themselves. Instead, specific interpretations proceed largely from the worldview of the interpreter. For example, to believe, as Sowell does, that colorblind policies represent the only legitimate and effective means of ensuring a racially equitable society, one would have to assume not only that there is only one proper role for law, but also that such a racially equitable society already exists. In this world, once law had performed its proper function of assuring equality of process, differences in outcomes between groups would not reflect past discrimination, but rather real differences between groups competing for societal rewards. Unimpeded by irrational prejudices against identifiable groups and unfettered by government-imposed preferences, competition would ensure that any group stratification would reflect only the cumulative effects of employers' rational decisions to hire the best workers for the least cost. The deprivations and oppression of the past would somehow be expunged from the present. Only in a society where all other societal functions operate in a non-discriminatory way would equality of process constitute equality of opportunity. This belief in color blindness and equal process, however, would make no sense at all in a society in which identifiable groups had actually been treated differently historically and in which the effects of this difference in treatment continued into the present. If employers were thought to have been influenced by factors other than the actual performance of each job applicant, it would be absurd to rely on their decisions as evidence of true market valuations. Arguments that differences in economic status cannot be redressed or are legitimate because they reflect cultural rather than racial inferiority would have to be rejected. Cultural disadvantages themselves would be seen as the consequence of historical discrimination. One could not look at the outcomes as a fair measure of merit, since one would recognize that everyone had not been given an equal start, because it would be apparent that institutions had embraced discriminatory policies in order to produce disparate results. It would be necessary to rely on results to indicate whether these discriminatory policies have been successfully dismantled. These two visions of society correspond closely to those held by Sowell and the civil rights visionaries. In each vision, all arguments about what the law is are premised upon what the law should be given a particular worldview. The conflict is not, as Sowell has suggested, between the true meaning of the law and a bastardized version, but between two different interpretations of society. Thus, though they attempt to lay claim to an apolitical perch from which to accuse civil rights visionaries of subverting the law to politics, the neoconservatives as well rely on their own political interpretations to give meaning to their respective concepts of rights and oppression. The crucial point that Sowell overlooks is that law itself does not dictate which of various visions will be adopted as an interpretive base. The choice between various visions and the values that lie within them is not guided by any determinate organizing principle. Consequently, Sowell has no basis from which to argue that color-conscious, result-oriented remedies are political perversions of the law, but that his preference, colorblind, process-oriented remedies are not. Subsection C, the constituency's dilemma. The passage of civil rights legislation nurtured the impression that the United States had moved decisively to end the oppression of blacks. The fanfare surrounding the passage of these acts, however, created an expectation that the legislation would not and could not fulfill. The law accommodated and obscured contradictions that led to conflict, countervision, and the current vacuousness of anti-discrimination law. Because anti-discrimination law contains both the expansive and restrictive view, equality of opportunity can refer to either. This uncertainty means that the societal adoption of racial equality rhetoric does not itself entail a commitment to end racial inequality. Indeed, to the extent that anti-discrimination law is believed to embrace color blindness, equal opportunity rhetoric constitutes a formidable obstacle to efforts to alleviate conditions of white supremacy. As Alfred Bloom-Rosen observes, it is clear that a colorblind society built upon the subordination of persons of one color is a society which cannot correct that subordination because it can never recognize it. In sum, the very terms used to proclaim victory contain within them the seeds of defeat. To demand equality of opportunity is to demand nothing specific because equality of opportunity has assimilated both the demand and the object against which the demand is made. It is to participate in an abstracted discourse which carries the moral force of the movement as well as the stability of the institutions and interests which the movement opposed. Society's adoption of the ambivalent rhetoric of equal opportunity law has made it that much more difficult for Black people to name their reality. There is no longer a perpetrator, a clearly identifiable discriminator. Company X can be an equal opportunity employer, even though Company X has no Blacks or any other minorities in its employ. Practically speaking, all companies can now be equal opportunity employers by proclamation alone. Society has embraced the rhetoric of equal opportunity without fulfilling its promise. Creating a break with the past has formed the basis for the neoconservative claim that present inequities cannot be the result of discriminatory practices because this society no longer discriminates against Blacks. Equal opportunity law may have also undermined the fragile consensus against white supremacy. To the extent that the objective of racial equality was seen as lifting formal barriers imposed against participation by Blacks, the reforms appear to have succeeded. Today, the claim that equal opportunity does not yet exist for Black America may fall upon deaf ears. Ears deafened by repeated declarations that equal opportunity exists. Even Alfred Bloomrosen himself, a civil rights visionary, demonstrates how the rhetoric of formal racial equality, by bringing about the collapse of overt obstacles, convince people that things have changed significantly. The public sympathy for the plight of Black Americans circa 1965 cannot be recreated because the condition of Black Americans in 1985 is so much improved as a result of the 1964 legislation. The success of the Civil Rights Act contained the seeds of its loss of public support. Racism alone simply will no longer do as an explanation for the current condition of depressed minorities. The rhetoric of the 60s sounds hollow to Americans of the 80s because it is hollow. Bloomrosen and others may be correct in pointing out that many things have changed under the political, legal, and moral force of the civil rights movement. Formal barriers have constituted a major aspect of the historic subordination of African Americans, and, as I discussed below, the elimination of those barriers was meaningful. Indeed, equal opportunity rhetoric gains its power from the fact that people can point to real changes that accompanied its advent. As the indeterminacy of doctrine reveals, however, what at first appears an unambiguous commitment to anti-discrimination conceals within it many conflicting and contradictory interests. In anti-discrimination law, the conflicting interests actually reinforce existing social arrangements, moderated to the extent necessary to balance the civil rights challenge with the many interests still privileged over it. The recognition on the part of civil rights advocates that deeper institutional changes are required has come just as the formal changes have begun to convince people that enough has been done. Indeed, recent cases illustrate that the judiciary's commitment to racial equality has waned considerably. These doctrinal and procedural developments, taken along with the overall political climate, indicate that the policy of redressing discrimination no longer has the high priority it once had. As Derek Bells argues, at heart, many of the cases seem to reflect an unwillingness that has been evident since Washington versus Davis to further expand remedies for discrimination. In discussing what he views as the waning of the commitment to achieve a non-racist society, Bell observes, discrimination claims, when they are dramatic enough and do not greatly threaten majority concerns, are given a sympathetic hearing. But there is a pervasive sense that definite limits have been set on the weight that minority claims receive when balanced against majority interest. The flagging commitment of the courts and of many whites to fighting discrimination may not be the only deleterious effect of civil rights reforms. The lasting harm must be measured by the extent to which limited gains hamper efforts of African Americans to name their reality and to remain capable of engaging in collective action in the future. The danger of adopting equal opportunity rhetoric on its face is that the constituency incorporates legal and philosophical concepts that have an uneven history and an unpredictable trajectory. If the civil rights constituency allows its own political consciousness to be completely replaced by the ambiguous discourse of anti-discrimination law, it will be difficult for it to defend its genuine interest against those whose interests are supported by opposing visions that also lie within the same discourse. The struggle, it seems, is to maintain a contextualized, specified worldview that reflects the experience of Blacks. The question remains whether engaging in legal reform precludes this possibility.